Welcome to this Sussex Universe lecture. My name is John Drury. I'm Professor of Social Psychology in the School of Psychology. And in this lecture, I'm going to ask, how does behaviour spread from one person to another? Contagion is one answer to that question. But in this lecture, I shall seek to persuade you that for all its popularity and its apparent intuitive appeal, the concept of contagion conceals more than it reveals about how behaviour spreads. And that in fact, we need different concepts and a different terminology to talk and think about the spread of behaviours. So first, I'd like to get you to cast your minds back 9 years to 2011, and the four major news events of that year, all of which were related to the spread of behaviour. One was the Arab Spring, which was a series of protest events that spread across Egypt, Tunisia, Yemen, Bahrain, Libya, and other countries. A second was the story about the plunging financial markets, which took place in July, and we were told that fear and panic were spreading across investors in different countries. A third was the Occupy movement, which began in Wall Street, New York, which spread to other cities across the United States and across the world, including, if you remember, outside St. Paul's Cathedral in London. And the fourth is the one I'm going to focus on in this lecture, which is the spread of riots in England in August of that year. Now, each of these collective events, to various degrees, was described as a contagion. But what is contagion? What do we mean by that term? Well, it means that behaviours spread simply through touch, exposure, or contact, literally or metaphorically, like a disease. And it comes from the Latin con, meaning together with, and togere, meaning to touch. And in fact, this idea is extremely popular in the social and behavioural sciences. We did a Google Scholar search a few years ago, and we found over 500 hits for articles with contagion in the title, and none of these were about contagion in the sense of disease. They were about simple behaviours like smiling and clapping, anxiety, excitement, yawning and scratching, but also complex phenomena like obesity, suicide, market behaviour, rioting, of course, and panic. And these studies of spreading behaviour were across a variety of different disciplines too, not only psychology, but also marketing, public opinion research, sociology, animal behaviour studies, economics, and public health. So where does the idea of contagion as behaviour come from? One of its key origins is in early so-called crowd science, the first supposedly scientific studies of the crowd, which developed in late 19th century France. And it developed there because at the time France was faced with crisis, social problems. There were a series of revolutions, there were industrial action, there was urbanisation as people left the villages and moved into the cities to work in the mills. And in order to understand and to combat these social problems, the early theorists drew upon concepts from medicine and biology to understand what was happening to people when they gathered in crowds. And the first of the crowd scientists was Hippolyte Taine, who used the term contagion alongside feverishness and other concepts. But the most famous of the crowd scientists was Gustave Le Bon, who developed the contagion concept further. He said it was an effect of suggestion, which is rather like a process of hypnosis, which happens to people when they enter crowds. And he said that anyone is susceptible to this process, which he defined as a process of uncritical social influence. So just any idea, any sentiment, any behaviour spreads through the crowd. So here you can see part of the problem. Why are these early theorists, these crowd psychologists, not using language like spread or transmission or influence, something more neutral? Because they are pathologizing the crowd. They're seeking to pathologize the crowd by likening social behavior to an illness, implying that it's something bad and saying that it's mindless, it's automatic, doesn't require thinking, doesn't require critical thought. It's passive, it's primitive, it's irrational. So it's not a neutral term, and historically it has been a weapon in the war on the crowd. But you may say, well, that's interesting historically, that that's how it arose, but what's the evidence? And particularly in crowds, does contagion occur? Some of the work in the 20th century, there's been years, decades of research which has contradicted some of the ideas of the early theorists, but I want to pick out two good examples. One is from Milgram and Tock, who pointed out that there seems to be a contradiction between the idea of contagion, that any ideas spread through the crowd, and the observation that in many riots you see a crowd demagogue who uses rhetoric to influence the crowd to behave in a particular way, but that doesn't spread to the riot police, who are also present in the same crowd. They don't seem to be influenced. And then in the 1980s, Steve Reicher's study of the St Paul's riot, which took place in Bristol in 1980, observed that some behaviours spread in that crowd and others did not. So when somebody threw stones at the police, everybody joined in. When somebody threw stones at a bus, people expressed disapproval and they didn't join in. So there are these limits that we need to explain. But as we return to the English riots of 2011, there is something to explain, because we know from decades of research, from historians, sociologists, criminologists, mathematical modelers, that when riots occur, other riots occur. Riots influence the occurrence of further riots. And this is on top of factors such as deprivation. There's something influential about riots. So if it's not contagion, how can we explain the process? Let me give you a bit of background on the August 2011 riots, first of all. There were over 100 disorders, riots, over 4 days in England in August that year. Around five people were killed and over 200 police were injured, or at least that's the figure we have. Over 4,000 people were arrested, although around only half of those came to court. There were nearly 2,000 incidents of criminal damage and arson, and around 2,000 acquisitive crimes, that means looting. And the final bill for damages, loss of trade and policing, was up to £500 million. The precipitating incident for the riots happened in Tottenham in North London, and it was the shooting by police of a local mixed heritage man, Mark Duggan, in Tottenham Hale. That happened on the Thursday the 4th, and the family protested outside Tottenham police station on Saturday the 6th because they still hadn't had an official communication from the police about the killing. So family and friends and supporters, local people protested, and eventually that became an outbreak of violence shortly after a police intervention. So that was the first rioting. And over the next 24 hours, rioting spread to Tottenham and Wood Green in North London, and then took the form of looting, because initially it was attacks on the police and certain kinds of property like solicitors, but later it turned into looting. Now, that was North London. And can anybody guess the first location to riot in South London? Well, it was Brixton in South London. And I'll discuss in a moment why that was, but you can just see here how the following day so many other locations in London saw rioting. And then the day after that, further locations in London saw rioting. The day after that, the rioting spread to major cities across England. But by the fifth day, rioting had spread to further cities across England, but was starting to die down in London. So when you heard about the rioting in Tottenham and other places, did you feel like taking to the streets? Well, maybe you did, maybe you didn't. Some people did and some people didn't. And I think this is the core problem to be explained. And I want to tell you briefly about our work on addressing this problem. It's from our ESRC funded grant called Beyond Contagion. And I want to tell you, first of all, a bit about our methodological approach. We drew upon multiple sources of evidence and data, including over 150 newspaper sources, 40 official reports, over 250 videos, nearly 3 million tweets, the police data on offences and arrests. And we also drew upon a large database of interviews that were gathered not by us, but by the Guardian newspaper and the LSE in a project that was called Reading the Riots. And you might have read about that in the newspaper at the time. It was a major investigation. And the beauty of that, of course, was they carried out these interviews in the months following the riots. They guaranteed people anonymity, and they carried out these interviews at a time when what had happened was fresh in people's minds. So it's far better than our group trying to carry out the interviews several years later. And we had access to that database, and we fully redacted every interview so that we could use it for our project. And we had two kinds of research design within this part of the project. First of all, we triangulated evidence to determine what happened within the major incidents. So what were the contours of the event? When did it start? When did it finish? What were the targets and so on? And then we used the interviews to understand participants' experiences, their motivations, their perceptions, and how they saw rioting elsewhere. And that helped us to understand the psychology of spread. So for the part of the study I want to tell you about, I'm going to focus on just events in South London at three locations in South London. And you can see on the slide, I'm going to be talking about Brixton, Clapham, and then the four at the bottom are all Croydon. And one of the reasons for focusing on these is the theoretical problem of explaining spread, because we know we have some evidence that the initial spread around Tottenham to Tottenham Hale was of people in the same location travelling. But the police arrest data suggest that there's little evidence of people travelling across the river in those first 24, 48 hours. So that means that at least, many of the people, most of the people probably taking part in the rioting in these locations in South London had not been taking part in the rioting in North London, and therefore they were probably influenced by those events in North London. So I mentioned that Brixton was the first place in South London to riot. And the question is, why? Why was Brixton first? And something that came across in all the interviews that were carried out in those South London locations was that so many people were hostile to the police. That was a very common theme in the interviews. And it's important because anti-police violence was a feature of what people did. So it would suggest that a kind of precondition of the spread of rioting was that hostility to the police. So it seems to be sufficient, but it's obviously not enough to explain why Brixton came first if everybody interviewed is so hostile. So what in particular was it about Brixton that led it to riot first in South London? And part of the answer to that is that Brixton people, when they talked in these interviews about the events in Tottenham, it was clear that they identified with people in Tottenham. They identified with Tottenham historically. They shared a history with Tottenham of racist policing, of stop and search by the police, of brutality by police, and a resistance to that brutality. So they said what happened in Tottenham could have happened here, in fact did happen here in the past. And therefore the events in Tottenham were highly relevant to their collective sense of who they were. And this identification with Tottenham meant that they felt the same anger as Tottenham people about the injustice of the killing of Mark Duggan. And I've got a quote to illustrate some of this. I would have been there because I see myself as part of that same community, meaning in Tottenham. That could have been anyone instead of Mark Duggan that day. That could have been me. That could have been my friends. And in addition to that sense of identification with people in Tottenham, with Tottenham and its history, was a process of meta-perception, which means beliefs about others' beliefs for people locally. People believed that other people in Brixton felt the same way, that other people in Brixton identified, that other people in Brixton were angry and felt the same sense of injustice. And because they believed that, they expected local people to riot, to be on the streets, to act in Brixton like people did in Tottenham. And so those expectations of people being on the street meant expectations of support for rioting. So if you wanted to riot, you felt that rioting, taking to the streets was right. You knew that people locally would be doing the same thing and would enable you to do that. And so you would be empowered to come onto the street and to riot. So one of the interviewees says, in response to the question, how did you know it was going to happen? Because I got an inkling, I had it. The police had it, everyone knew. So the interviewer says, so because there'd been riots and there was a street party, everyone is expecting it to kick off. Is that what you're saying? That's exactly what I'm saying. So the street party was mentioned there, and undoubtedly that was a factor too, because the street party happening over the weekend after the Tottenham rioting was an opportunity for people not only to infer what others were thinking, but to see it. They could see when they were on the streets that other people felt the same as them, felt the same anger, the same sense of injustice. There was a street party, and then after everyone heard about the Tottenham thing, there was this thing going around that everyone's going to do it in Brixton. So not only the same feeling, but the sense that this was ready to translate into action. So that was Brixton. But when we looked more closely at the interviews of people in Clapham and Croydon, some of them did identify with Tottenham. Some of them said, yeah, as a black British person, I can see this is us, what's happened in Tottenham. But many more did not. And many said that was not the reason they were on the streets. It was not because of Duggan. It was another reason, right? And it was because they were empowered. So they weren't identifying, but they were empowered by seeing a common enemy weaken. So the hatred of the police and seeing the police weakened by so many riots taking place elsewhere. And I put on the slide again the list of places. And so cumulatively, you can see the police under pressure. But again, you got that meta-perception process whereby the proximal cause, the reason that they came onto the street, the direct reason they came onto the streets was because they were assuming that other people in their area felt the same way. They hated the police. They, similarly to themselves, could see that the police were weakened, and that encouraged them to come onto the streets. So in summary then, for this line of work, identity and empowerment and expectations of what others, like oneself, are going to do are the mechanisms, or were the mechanisms, that we identified in this study that explained or helped explain why rioting spread to South London from North London. So that was complex behaviours, and you might say, well, okay, but what about these simple behaviours? Surely, in this case, these behaviours, yawning and emotion and scratching, surely these spread through mere exposure. These are simple processes. But here, again, there is evidence that the identity of the target, the identity of the person you see exhibiting these behaviours matters, and that there is group-based, identity-based boundaries to the process of influence. So one nice illustrative study for this is a study by Job van der Schalk, who manipulated the identity of the model, the person displaying, in this case, emotion. Made them an in-group or an out-group. So, for example, you've got Sussex students who are your participants in your experiment, and you tell them that the person displaying the emotion is a Sussex student. And the thing about emotion is it's meant to be very basic. Again, it's meant to be kind of precognitive, that the influence, the mimicry takes place in your facial musculature before you become cognitively aware of it. And so the way that it's measured in some of these studies, and in this one, is through putting electrodes on the face and feeling and detecting the movement of the muscles before someone's kind of registering and consciously aware of a particular emotion. So in this study, Job van der Schalk found that in-group anger and fear were mimicked much more than out-group displays of the same emotion. So something even as apparently basic and primitive as that. In our own research, we've looked at different kinds of behaviours that are also considered simple and perhaps precognitive. So, looking at this picture, do you feel itchy? And what about if I tell you that these people in the picture are Sussex University students? Well, they are, actually. So again, in these studies, we want to test the idea that it's the identity of the person you observe that makes a crucial difference, and even for the simplest of behaviours. And one of the simplest of behaviours that has been studied in this framework is yawning. So the supposed contagion of yawning is meant to be one of the most basic, primitive, precognitive responses. So if we find any evidence that it's constrained by social or enabled by social identity processes, it's a strong test of our hypothesis. So this experiment was pre-registered, which means that we registered the design, the measures, and the hypotheses beforehand, and then what we did was kind of measured against that previously stated design and so on. We presented two models. In fact, the model on the left is one of our researchers. Two models, a female and a male yawner. And in a 2-minute clip, the yawners yawn 8 times. And the participants are male and female. So basically, you've got an in-group yawner or an out-group yawner. And in the experiment, people are filmed on their webcams yawning or not yawning. That's one of the measures. The other measures are self-report. So they write down they report after seeing the video how much they felt like yawning, how many times they think they yawned. So that's one set of measures, the dependent measures, the outcome measures, but we also took mediator measures, and the mediators are the kind of mechanisms, the processes by which we think some of this occurs. And the key one for us, of course, is shared identity, that the extent to which they see the person in the video as in their group, as relevant to them. Okay. We also took a moderator measure. So a moderator measure is something which increases the effect of the predictor and the mediator on the outcome. So here it was the extent to which the category here, gender, being male or female, is important to you. So the more important the category is to you, the more likely we think you are to be influenced by seeing someone in that category exhibiting that behaviour. We also took a number of control measures, including the time of day, the room temperature, the extent to which people were sleepy beforehand, age, and susceptibility to emotional contagion, which is a standard scale. This is the result. And the first thing to say, the headline in this actually, is that it's quite difficult to get this simple kind of mimicry in the lab. So if you're measuring how many times people yawned, I have to tell you it wasn't that many. It certainly wasn't 8 per participant. It was low. It was hard to get people to mimic. So perhaps it's not so contagious after all. We didn't either get a main effect, which is a direct in-group, out-group difference in the extent to which people yawned when they saw the target. But what we did get is what's depicted in this model, which is called a moderated mediation. So for the mediation part, what's going on here is that the extent to which the model is in-group predicts the extent to which you see the in-group, the target as relevant to you, as sharing identity with you. That influences your urge to yawn, and that influences in turn the extent to which you do yawn. Okay, but that process only occurred for those for whom the identity, the category, was important. So the more your male identity, your female identity was important to you, the more likely it was that seeing somebody in that category yawning would set off this process of noticing that they were in your group and feeling like yawning and then actually yawning. And that is a pattern, in fact, that we found quite a few times, not only for yawning, but also for scratching. So there seems to be something quite general in it. Now, when I make this argument about the problems of the concept of contagion, people who know the literature point out to me that, in fact, many of the studies and theories that use the concept of contagion also include a number of additional variables that intervene between mere exposure and what people actually do, like cognition or disinhibition or all sorts of factors. And they say, well, this shows you that you can still use the concept of contagion. My answer to that is, the more of these intervening variables that you include, the more it only demonstrates the weakness of the contagion concept. Because what the contagion concept gives you is the idea that it is mere exposure that is the mechanism of spread. And the more of these you add in, the less of that key idea you've got left. So let me move on to my take-home message or take-home messages, and I've divided them into 4. So the first message is to acknowledge that spread of behaviour is socially and psychologically important across a range of phenomena, from the macro to the micro, from the objective to the experiential. It's important. It's important to explain. But second, contagion is a problematic way to conceptualise this social influence process, because firstly, we show that it's not mindless, that the cognition is involved, and that cognition, at least in some instances, is about who the target is. It's about group boundaries, and group boundaries shape and limit that influence process. So the third point is then that our identity, thinking about ourselves, and the identity of the target, and the match between the two, is important in spread, at least in the examples that I've been talking about. And so fourth and finally then, we need a different way of talking and conceptualising spread than contagion. Can't we just be more neutral, talk about influence, talk about transmission, talk about spread? Get away from this pathologising discourse, and that will take us forward into a new and more productive theoretical framework for understanding this important process. So that's me, and I'd like to finish by acknowledging my funder, which is the ESRC, and my colleagues who were involved in the research I've told you about, Fergus Neville, Roger Ball, Steve Reicher and Clifford Stott. And if you want to read about more of this work, there's the URL for our research website, there's my email, and there is my Twitter handle. Thank you very much.
Well, we hope you enjoyed this video. Once again, I've got to ask, if you did enjoy it, please give the video a like and subscribe to our channel to see our future updates. If you're interested in the future talks we've got coming up, do visit our website at bit.ly/Sussex Universe. And remember, if you're watching live, the live Q&A starts now at the Zoom link in the description down below.